Welcome to the Compounding Center Connections podcast, where we talk about different health conditions with our partnered practitioners. I'm your host, Jay Gill, a compounding pharmacist from the Compounding Center in Leesburg, Virginia. At the Compounding Center, we collaborate with practitioners, create custom medications to help our patients get better. So in today's episode, our guest is Dr. Jonah Yakel, the brain health doctor. Welcome, Dr. Yakel. Thanks for joining us on this episode.
Jay, hey, thanks for having me on. I'm so excited to be joining you today.
So could you please introduce yourself to the viewers and listeners out there?
Yeah, a little bit of background, I guess. I've been in practice for 15, actually about 17, going on 20 years here, not before long. Time flies. About 20 years ago, I got my degree in chiropractic. And my passion and desire has always really been very much in functional medicine and nutrition and things of that nature. And, I've had several brick and mortars. I operated a brick and mortar in Overland Park, Kansas for over a decade, and more just transitioning, doing more and more functional medicine. And then basically based off my own health challenges that hit probably somewhere around 2017, 2018, which maybe we'll touch on a little bit today, I was somewhat forced into moving my practice remote as I was transitioning and, healing and recovering from my own past, health challenges. Much of which was brain related, coming from both, history of head injuries and then mold exposures and mold toxicity. So, I've had my bout. I know exactly what it feels like to experience cognitive decline, and that's a little bit of an understatement. If we have time to get into my story, whether that's today or maybe in future episodes or something, but. So after I was in a very, very severe car accident about a decade ago, I started really gaining more and more passion for learning how to manage inflammation. And that just kind of opened up this huge world of, entering into brain health, recovering from a brain injury, from the car accident that I was in. And then, of course, for anybody who's anywhat familiar with mold and Lyme and long COVID, there's a huge cognitive component to that as well. So as I was going through my recovery and healing from mold related illness, I had such severe fatigue and brain fog and cognitive dysfunction. Like it was a real challenge. So I mean, it's just like a lot of my passion stems from, my own recovery and my own healing and things that I've had to do for myself in order to be able to heal and function, and then really ultimately to bring this out into the world and to be able to serve other people and to help other people who are going through, similar challenges, who are dealing with cognitive changes, dealing with chronic fatigue, dealing with chronic pain, and yet they're not getting answers. Like it's like we go to doctor after doctor after doctor. No one can figure out what's wrong with us. Worst case scenario, we're usually often told it must just be in our head, which, sometimes it is. If it's brain inflammation, it is in our head, but not in the way that they're saying that it's in our head. So, I'm trying to provide solutions to people who are struggling with really chronic situations, especially associated with cognitive decline, and, giving them the most cutting edge, up to date tools and strategies to heal and recover, get their brains back, get their lives back.
Well, today's topic is just on that, cognitive decline. And before we get started, just a disclaimer for everyone. The information we discuss today is just for informational purposes only. It's not for diagnosis or treatment. So, Dr. Yakel, what are some causes of cognitive decline that we should be aware of?
Well, cognitive decline is very interesting because, it covers, it's like an umbrella term for anything ranging from brain fog, which, I think brain fog in itself, it's a little bit of a minimization, because if someone's experiencing brain fog, whether they know it or not, they're likely experiencing brain inflammation that's causing their brain to be foggy. So when we say we've got brain fog, it's kind of minimizes what's actually going on, and it can actually be an early indicator for cognitive decline. But then, of course, dementia, and that covers all forms of different cognitive decline, including Alzheimer's. And we know that, that these things are multifactorial. There's no one root cause. And one of the major challenges that we run into, Jay, when it comes to cognitive decline is that they're really the current medical model really doesn't provide any good solutions. In fact, the last drug that was developed to treat Alzheimer's is over 15 years at this point. And I know one came out a couple of years ago and they were very excited about it, and it pretty much crashed and burned. It didn't work at all. It ended up making a lot of people worse. But the best case scenario, all we can do is slow down the disease process. And then when you factor in that this is the fastest growing disease process in the country today, and it's set to triple over the next 20 to 30 years. I mean, I think they're estimating that 1 in 4 people are going to end up with some form of dementia. Like, this is a rapidly growing crisis. And it's incredibly expensive. It's the most expensive disease process to treat. So getting ahead of this and preventing it is so incredibly important, especially if we see it in our family members, and there might be a genetic component to it. So it's really all about prevention. But we have seen cases of people slowing, stopping, and even reversing symptoms of dementia and Alzheimer's. But the major root causes, as it's coming into understanding, as we're learning more and more about what drives this, there's a handful of really big things that need to be addressed. So number one would be inflammation. And by the way, a really great resource for anybody who's trying to learn more about this on their own too, outside of the podcast. Of course, we've got more podcasts and whatnot, but a man named Dale Bredesen has really done some groundbreaking work around this area and has actually helped create like a model to follow, so to speak. And he wrote a book called The End of Alzheimer's. But so number one is inflammation. So addressing inflammation, we know that inflammation is at the root cause of all disease processes. For the most part, heart disease, diabetes, cancers, arthritis, autoimmune conditions all have severe inflammation at the root cause. And of course, it shouldn't be surprising that an inflamed brain is also going to cause problems. So inflammation is one of the many root causes. Another one that we have to look at is it would be hormone deficiency, so low functioning hormones. We have all of these wonderful hormones, in our body that obviously can help keep us feeling vibrant and young and all these various other things. But what we don't recognize is that a lot of these hormones, Jay, are neuro or brain protective. So everything from thyroid hormone, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, vitamin D, which is actually functions more like a hormone than it does like a vitamin, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. There's all of these hormones that our brain needs to heal and repair itself. And when these hormones drop, as we age, our body is reaching out for these hormones, like it's needing them in order to heal and repair and to protect the brain, but we don't have them in the amounts that are necessary. So that can lead to a form of cognitive decline. And in fact, this is one of the big connections between, a lot of people may not know this, but the majority, about 65% of all Alzheimer's cases are in women. So this is something that tends to touch women a little bit more than it impacts men. And this is one of the theories behind that, is that, once, women hit menopause, which of course men can hit andropause too, which would cause low functioning hormones. But once women hit menopause and those hormones drop down, again, they lose, some of those brain protective qualities of those hormones. So, it's essential to, one, learn how to manage inflammation. Two, it's essential to make sure that we, continue to manage and support healthy, robust levels of hormones, even as we age. Number three would be blood sugar. And this one, Jay, this is fascinating. Blood sugar it has such a correlation to Alzheimer's and dementia that at this point, there are experts out there that refer to Alzheimer's as diabetes type 3. Like, it is so, right, it is so correlated that some experts are looking at this and they're like, this is just another form of diabetes. Now, a lot of listeners out there might be saying, oh, okay, great. Well, I don't have any blood sugar issues. I just had my checkup. My glucose was fine. Well, study came out, Jay, you may have seen this one. Study came out over the summer that said that 93% of Americans have dysfunctional metabolism, which essentially is a way of saying that 93% of Americans are insulin resistant, which is the early, pre-diabetes, so to speak. And, it takes decades for someone has to be insulin resistant for years, even decades before their lab starts showing up as even being pre-diabetic. So, a lot of people out there who are running just your typical, doctor's labs, like looking at glucose and maybe even A1C, it's like, oh, my blood sugar is great. But most doctors aren't looking at fasting insulin. And in order for us to determine if someone's insulin resistant, like how well are you metabolizing, blood sugar and glucose and carbohydrates and things like that, we've got to know what the fasting insulin is and how it compares to glucose. And from that, we can actually determine if someone is in fact insulin resistant. But just think about that for a minute. So that means that 7% of Americans have healthy blood sugar. 7%. It's like no wonder, we're like, Alzheimer's dementia is blowing up if there's such a huge correlation. And, honestly, if we were to stop there and just say, look, inflammation, hormones, blood sugar, like if that's all you did was manage those things. And in fact, I might even back it up a little bit, Jay. If all we do is manage inflammation and balance out blood sugar, well, oftentimes the hormones take care of themselves when you do that. So, I often tell people when they come to see me for the first time, it's like, look, if all we accomplish is getting your blood sugar balanced and mastering your inflammation, like it's going to transform your health for decades to come. And oftentimes those aren't all that challenging to do. Like that can pretty much be managed through lifestyle and some supplementation pretty easily. So, but those three are really the biggies. And then some of the harder ones hit. So number 4 would be environmental toxins. Something we're all exposed to, right? I mean, we're living in a toxic world at this point. I mean, we don't live in the Garden of Eden anymore, right? I mean, the food we eat is toxic. What we're drinking is toxic. The air we're breathing is toxic. We live in homes that are water damaged, that are toxic, that are contributing. So everything from the glyphosates and the herbicides and the pesticides, the heavy metals, the molds, biotoxins like Lyme and long COVID. So these are all contributing factors. And then circulation. So, poor cardiovascular health, not enough circulation, not getting enough blood flow to the brain. And then finally, just to kind of cap it off, so, we don't spend too much time just going through the summary here, but, the other major factor would be a head injury, which can trigger some neuro or brain inflammation. And then now all of a sudden we have to deal with, some of these other factors also, because once the brain gets inflamed, and it starts to degenerate, it's just like game on. It's like that can impact hormones, that can impact blood sugar. So I mean, it's multifactorial. And when people come to see me, the goal is to find out, to prioritize those. It's like, let's run some comprehensive labs. Let's find out what our priorities is. Is it toxins? Is it blood sugar? Is it inflammation? Is it hormones? Is it all of the above? And from there, we can start putting together recovery plans. Like, all right, so now that we know what potential root causes are, it's like, let's start here. Let's get your blood sugar balance. And in that way, we just, start kind of peeling back the onion and helping people heal and recover and hopefully get their brains back.
Well, so one question becomes, how do you know if it's age related or it's related to one of these causes? You know what I mean? Like,
yes,
I'm listening to you and I'm going, wow. We could probably take a deeper dive into each one of these reasons. But first thing, how do I know, is it just age, perhaps?
Well, that's a great question. And my follow-up question to that would be, what is age? Like, how do we define aging? Because what we know is that things such as inflammation speed up the aging process. Right. And in fact, it's like, I look even into my own practice. It's like I've had clients who are 80 who literally have a biology of like a 50 or 60-year-old. And then I've had 50 or 60-year-olds who have the biology of an 80-year-old, and it's like, I think we all have had this experience. So it's like, age is, it really has more to do with what is our biological age. And so what I would say is that when it comes to cognitive, it's like, look, we're all getting older. We're all aging. None of us are immortal, physically speaking. It's like we're all going to die at some point. However, that being said, it's like what is speeding up that aging process? And we know that inflammation is a huge player in speeding up the aging process. We know that hormones are are, it's like the longer, the higher our hormone levels are for longer periods. It's like, when our hormones start dropping off. So, men, testosterone starts dropping off about 1% per year at about 40 years old. Women, they hit menopause, those hormones drop off. When those hormones drop off, the aging process speeds up. I mean, look at the correlation between, menopause and bone health, for instance. And it's not just the bones that are breaking down, it's the whole body that's breaking down. So hormones is very closely related to the aging process. And then, of course, blood sugar. It's like, look at anybody who's, diabetic. We know that diabetic reduces the longevity of life. And, it's a huge risk factor. And so, I would argue that those very things that we just discussed are speeding up the aging process. So it's like, well, is it aging or is it one of these things? Well, it's like, well, these things are causing the aging, which is then causing the cognitive decline. So I would always argue that, and again, it's not that we can stop the process entirely. We're going to age. And at the same time, it's like, well, we oftentimes have an option. It's like, well, we can choose to, put, energy into our health and, changing our lifestyle and using food for medicine, for instance, and slow down the aging process and live until we're, 80, 90 and live high quality lives. Or on the other hand, it's like, I think we've all seen people who, health starts dropping off 50, 60. And, oftentimes, modern medicine can keep us alive, but it doesn't mean we're living like a high quality life by any means. So, I would say it is aging, and and it's being caused from something. So it's like, I just think about it, it's like when I first noticed my own cognitive changes, I remember telling my wife, I remember being like, hey, it's like my memory is just not quite as sharp as it was. And she's, oh, you're just getting older, and I'm like, but why am I getting older? It was because my brain was inflamed. Like, yes, I was getting older. I was degenerating. But so I think that, might be a long answer to a simple question. But, I think these root causes are what drives the aging and then causes the symptoms.
I mean, that perfectly makes sense. We're aging quicker because we're not controlling inflammation, or circulation is not optimal and things like that. So
toxicity, absolutely.
Yeah, you're so correct. Now, if somebody listening to this podcast or watching us our video, and they're wondering, well, I wonder, I am forgetting things. Is there a questionnaire or something that you have either on your website, or do you recommend that somebody could perhaps do some basic questionnaire and then reach out to you and say, hey, what do you think?
Well, that's a good question. There's quite a bit of different things out there available for like just testing, cognitive function. The one that comes to mind that I use a lot in my own practice. So this may not necessarily be optimal for everyone, but there's something called a VCS test. So VCS, like the letters, it stands for visual contrast sensitivity. Now, I work with a lot of people who are struggling with chronic health conditions, primarily biotoxin related. So people, struggling with mold related illness, people dealing with like Lyme disease, people dealing with, say, long COVID. But a VCS test, this was developed by the armed forces, to my understanding, and it was used to test troops when they were coming back from a deployment. They could quickly screen these troops to see if there was any indication of neuro or brain inflammation. So this is actually a quick thing that I'll use for screening. Like if someone's coming to me and they're like, I think I got mold related illness, or I think I've got long COVID, or I think I've got, Lyme disease, we can have them do a VCS test and it will screen and it will tell us if in fact they do have, at least do they have brain inflammation. And then from there, through a questionnaire of what we would consider a symptom analysis, we can actually, correlate the two. Like, are your symptoms consistent with someone who's got mold-related illness versus someone who's got, brain inflammation? Like, are you in fact, being impacted by some kind of exposure to a biotoxin? So, but that's kind of a specialized, circumstance. As far as a brain health, like just an overall checklist, I know there's a lot of things like a MOCA has been developed, and these are ways that they'll track people. That's an MOCA test. This is the ways that they'll actually track people to see if they're, if they're showing indications of cognitive decline, or early on. But, honestly, I think it's just simpler than that. I think it's just like the four hallmark symptoms of brain inflammation are going to be brain fog. So like, are you noticing some changes in your memory? Like for me, the way it showed up, Jay, was I just started forgetting names. Like, and again, I think that's something we all just write off. It's like, I'm just getting older. But it's an indication of a brain that's degenerating, like whether we like it or not. That's what's happening. That's why our brain's not working anymore. So that is a sign that you should be supporting, the brain health, that it's already starting to change. So for me, names started dropping off. Eventually I started noticing I was losing things more frequently. Again, most people are like, yeah, I forget where I put my keys. Again, these are all just like indicators. And I think a lot of us want to ignore these things, or just be like, just getting older. It's not a big deal. But truth is that the sooner you address these things, the better likelihood there is to reverse these things. And it is actually totally reversible in many, many cases.
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that it is reversible. Now, are there any other key tests that you use in your practice to kind of prove and show the patient almost like evidence and say, this is the course of therapy and this is why, your cognitive function is declining? Are there any specific tests that you use in your practice?
Yeah, well, so normally what I'll do when people come to me is like, we're going to run a comprehensive like functional blood panel, and we're going to be evaluating all those root causes, right? So it's like we're going to run inflammatory panels. So we're looking at 4 or 5 different inflammatory markers. We're looking at hormones, like what's the hormone status? We're looking at indications of blood sugar or insulin resistance. We're looking at cardiovascular health. We're looking at toxicity. We're looking at all of these root causes. And then what that allows us to do is, once we've got those labs in hand, we can actually sit down, we can go over it, and we can say, okay, like based off what we're seeing here, your biggest risk factor might be X, Y, or Z. Maybe it's blood sugar. So let's start there. Let's get the blood sugar balance, and then let's go from there. And and then maybe it's hormones, maybe it's inflammation. So generally, the primary guiding factor is going to be based off of labs, because that's going to show us what's going on inside, like what's happening actually inside the body that could be increasing risk and driving some of the symptoms that people are experiencing. Or maybe they're just looking for wellness. Maybe they're showing up and they're like, look, I saw one of my parents go through this, and I don't want this to happen to me. Like, what do I need to start doing now to prevent this from happening? So again, at that point, we're still running all the same labs, but we're taking more of a preventative approach.
And could you talk to us a little bit about someone who perhaps wants to just say, what do I do today, and what do I put in, a diet, or what foods do I eat that I could control inflammation? Any suggestions there that?
Yeah. Well, and that's such a great question, because it doesn't have to be overly complicated. It's like the primary diet that I start most people on is just going to be a basic like paleo-based diet. Like, we want a low inflammatory diet. So paleo-based diet is eating mostly animal proteins, vegetables, and fruits. It's kind of like real food. Like this is what humans were made to eat. So we're removing the processed foods, we're removing the sugars. We're removing grains, which I know, some people are not super excited about that, but grains can be very inflammatory to the gut. So getting, and not to mention that they tend to be fairly high starch. So we're removing a lot of the high starchy foods, like, the breads, the pastas, things that we all like, and quite frankly, that most of us are addicted to, self included. I mean, I was one of the number one carb addicts back in the day, and it's something that I've just had to learn. Like, as I've prioritized my own brain health and the health of my own body, it's like, getting off some of these highly inflammatory foods is going to help, balance blood sugar. It's going to lower inflammation. And that's what I love about, say, a paleo diet. Now, if we wanted to take that a step further, what we know is that even being able to get our body into a state of ketosis, so a lot of people have heard of a ketogenic diet, and This gets a little more complicated because, there's such a thing as a clean ketogenic diet versus a non-clean like ketogenic diet. And, a lot of keto diets kind of get a bad rap. But I think bottom line, the whole purpose there is to get our body to where it's burning fat for fuel as opposed to carbohydrates for fuel. Because when we burn carbs for fuel, it's very inflammatory. When we burn fats for fuel, it makes ketones, which can actually heal and repair the brain. So, so getting people on a low carb paleo based diet is going to get multiple birds with one stone. It's going to lower inflammation. It's going to help balance blood sugar. And then when you accomplish those two, it helps boost and support healthy hormones. And then, we start detoxifying. So, I mean, that might be one of the most powerful things someone could do is get on a low carb paleo based diet. Just right out of the gate. And then, and there's a handful of different supplements that have, a lot of studies behind them, like curcumin and turmeric is, very anti-inflammatory, resveratrol, omega-3 oils. Those are just, a couple of really great things that further reduce inflammation and boost brain health.
Can we just jump to the supplements and what are your favorite supplements that you put people on with, let's say, a carnivore or a paleo diet?
Yeah, so I mean, if we're going, if we're going low carb diet, so it's all right, so someone shows up, and let's say again, maybe inflammation is the primary cause, because again, depending on what they're showing up with, if they've got low functioning hormones, I'm going to put them on a different supplement protocol than I would than if their blood sugar's imbalanced, which would be different than if the brain is or if inflammation is the problem. But generally speaking, if we're dealing with brain inflammation, some of my favorite just brain health supplements are going to be, if I were to say my top 5 right off the bat, would probably be I love turmeric and curcumin. I love resveratrol. That's probably one of my favorites for brain health. And normally, again, I'll put people on higher dosages of these when we first get started doing this for maybe the first 90 days to see if we can start bringing down that inflammation, boosting brain health. High doses of omega-3 oils are great. NAC and glutathione can help with detoxification, but that's one of our body's strongest antioxidants, and it's great for brain health. And Magnesium and vitamin D are also incredibly important for brain health. And usually, you don't want to supplement one without the other. If we're doing high doses of vitamin D too long, it can actually lower magnesium levels. But magnesium is incredibly important for brain health. And then, of course, vitamin D is also neuroprotective. It's great for brain health. Now, so that's kind of just like a core. Like if I was targeting inflammation, those are some of the things that I would be using. If we were doing something like more circulatory, it's like we might put up people on herbs to help increase circulation to the brain. If we were trying to boost hormones, we might do some things to boost testosterone or estrogen or progesterone, kind of whatever we're doing. But those would kind of be like my 5 top brain health supplements. Paired with say a paleo or carnivore diet. And we haven't gotten much into that today, but that's generally a diet that I will use in extreme circumstances when I have people with very severe autoimmune conditions or chronic illnesses. For a variety of reasons, it can be a very powerful healing tool when we put people on that for periods of time.
Well, Dr. Yakel, maybe I misunderstood. What's the difference between carnivore and paleo diet?
Okay, that's a great question. So a paleo-based diet. Yeah, so that good question. There's actually a very big difference. And it's basically plants. The short answer is plants is the difference. So a paleo-based diet, this was really kind of, the theory behind this, it kind of evolved out of well, this is how our ancestors ate. We ate, hunter-gatherer, right? So it's we would eat vegetables and we would eat fruits and occasionally we would get some meats in. So that's really what a paleo diet is. It's what did hunter-gatherers eat when we're looking at hunter-gatherer societies? They weren't growing wheat and eating, corn and things of that nature for the most part. That came later in evolution, but so animal proteins, vegetables, fruits, that's the core of a paleo. Now carnivore, Jay, that's taking it a step further. So in cases where I'm dealing with extreme chronic illnesses, oftentimes what happens is the gut gets so inflamed that it starts to damage the gut lining and these junctions or boundaries that are supposed to like prevent things from getting into your body that shouldn't start to become loose or leaky. And so people start developing what we would refer to as a leaky gut. And when that happens, we start developing all kinds of food sensitivities. Now, this becomes really problematic because now they've got one more thing that's making them more inflamed. So it's like now suddenly even eating healthy foods oftentimes can be inflammatory. Like we can develop, reactions to things like broccoli and romaine lettuce and the things you just would never assume could be possibly inflammatory for the body. But when the gut's damaged enough, it starts to become leaky. It starts letting in these things that aren't supposed to get there. Plants also come with, for all their benefits, all their phytonutrients, all their vitamins and minerals, they also come with a handful of different toxins, what we call phytotoxins, like oxalates, which can be very damaging to the gut and the body, and lectins. And so the concept with a carnivore is really based off the idea that, look, plants come with their own built-in defense system because they inherently don't want to be eaten. Like, they're intelligent. They want to live. They want to proliferate. They want to spread across the earth. They don't want anything eating it. So they develop their own toxins to prevent that from being eaten. Now, certain herbivores have these stomachs that can break down those toxins, great, but we don't have those stomachs. We lack those. So these phytotoxins can be very damaging and inflammatory to the gut. Now, and so at this point, when I'm dealing with these very chronic conditions where people can't seem to even eat anything without having reactions, we'll move them to a carnivore diet, which is just meat. So we'll take them off all plants and get all of these plant toxins off them, at least for a period of time. And what happens is when we remove all these oxalates and lectins, and now they're just eating meat. And I know this is crazy. This goes against everything most of us were ever taught. And when I first came across this, I'm like, this is nuts. Like, this can't possibly be. But the results speak for themselves. I've seen very, very extreme cases of autoimmune conditions, 80, 90%. Reversal of symptoms. And I'm talking like really severe rheumatoids and lupus and, even MS, some of these things turning around. And some of my most challenging, like long COVID and Lyme and mold related illnesses, turning around when people get on these carnivore diets, because it lowers inflammation so dramatically that a lot of these symptoms start to resolve. And then it allows the gut to heal and recover. So, I don't necessarily recommend that to everybody. It's like, it tends to be a little extreme for a lot of people. I'm not saying that it's inherently bad for anybody to do, but, most of the time, we can get away. If we're just looking to improve brain health, it's like, well, just getting on a paleo diet, low carb is going to be more than enough, oftentimes. But for those extreme cases where we're dealing with advanced chronic illnesses, sometimes we have to, fight fire with fire. It's like we have to use something a lot more extreme, and we'll put them on a carnivore diet, get them off all plants entirely, and really, I've seen miraculous things happen in those circumstances.
Thank you. Hey, one last question. Do you use any wearables or those continuous monitoring, devices, the tracking devices at all in your practice to kind of help the patient?
You bet. Well, one, I've got my this is not a this is not an advertisement, but I've got an Oura ring on right now. So okay. I wear my own Oura ring, tracking sleep. I mean, we know sleep is so incredibly important for brain health. Again, it's like our brain does all of its healing, its repair, its detoxification. That's all happening when we're sleeping at night. So if we're not sleeping adequately, like, you can forget all the supplements and diet that we're doing. So, I mean, it's such a huge piece of the puzzle, as is exercise, by the way. It's like exercise has been shown to maybe be one of the number one, things to lower risk factor. And this doesn't mean like hitting the gym for 2 hours every day. This could mean just getting in our 10,000, steps, like, walking for 40 minutes a day has literally been shown to reduce symptoms of cognitive decline. So it's like moving our body addressing that circulation element. So I love that. Continuous glucose monitors are fantastic also, because it can actually show us how foods are impacting our blood sugar. Because, a lot of times, again, people tend to minimize that's like, oh, well, I think my blood sugar is pretty good overall. Or, maybe I'll use these though, because usually just by changing the diet, we don't need to go so far to track glucose continuously. It's like, well, if we're making the dietary changes, they probably don't need to track it anymore. But that being said, sometimes we'll have cases where it's like we have a hard time reversing insulin resistance, and they seemingly are eating all the right things. So sometimes it can be helpful to use something like that to just kind of monitor and see, like, are we missing something? But yeah, a lot of these things, like these watches nowadays, it's like, it really is an opportunity for us to get feedback. Like, how is our body functioning? Like, what is it doing? It's like, I know a lot of these can even tell us, like, when our stress is getting elevated, like when the heart rate is going up. So it's like, it's almost like built-in biofeedback, right? It can tell us, hey, you're too stressed. You need to, like, take a breath and, like, bring it down a couple notches. And again, I think that's incredibly valuable in this day and age.
Well, Dr. Yakel, thank you for joining us. You shared such a wealth of information with us. How does someone reach out to you?
Well, there's a couple of ways you can reach out to me. One, if you're in, like, the DC metro area, I work with George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine. I've been with them primarily. I do consulting. I see the majority of their, or in fact, I see all of their situation with chronic inflammatory response syndrome. So again, mold, chronic Lyme, things of that nature. So if you're in the area, you can get connected with George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine. Remotely, I work with people all over the country. I've got my own private practice. You can just find my website. It's drjonahyakel.com. So just DR, and then my first name, JONAH, my last name, YAKEL.com. And, you can just jump on the website. We've got more podcasts on there. You can schedule discovery calls. There's a variety of different possibilities. So if you want to get in touch, you can check us out on the website, or you can go directly to GW. And yeah, if there's anybody out there who's feeling like they need support, they're struggling, or maybe maybe they're not struggling, maybe they're just concerned about the future. They want to heal and protect their brain. I'd be more than happy to have a conversation.
And I have to tell everybody that if you want to learn more and make yourself more knowledgeable, you have a great set of podcasts on your website that I think everyone should listen to. And I'll make sure to put all the contact information in our show notes. So including the couple of the tests that you mentioned and your favorite supplements also in the show notes for everyone.
Great. Well, Jay, I really appreciate you having me on. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone, for tuning into the Compounding Center Connections podcast. We hope the information discussed today was helpful to you. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to reach out to me at jay@compoundingcenter.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and our podcast channel, The Compounding Center Connections. Give us a 5-star review and stay tuned for future episodes. Thank you, Dr. Yakel.
Hey, thank you.